Okay, my name is Maria Sharp, and I'll be your host for today. And I am situated in Edmonton, Alberta, within Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis Homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 4. I'm just working on a few security things here. Stand by. Thank you. All right. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. We are proud to offer this webinar in both English and French through the use of our live translators. I just want to show a couple things here on the screen. For some reason, I have the audience coming in as speakers, so I apologize for this. I'm just going to change something here on my events. Stand by. Thank you for your patience. All right. We are proud to offer this webinar in both English and French through the use of live translators. If you'd prefer to listen to this in French, I'm just going to see its mirrored view. So over here to your far right and at the bottom, you can change the floor to be both English or French, depending on what you'd prefer. So si vous préférez écouter en français, cliquez ici, down here at the bottom. All right. The help button just to the bottom left is a question mark for live support. If you need any help in any of the technological issues, we do have live support here to help support you on that, just down on the bottom left. And then at the top right, there's a chat button. So feel free to ask questions as we go, comments as we go. At the top right, there's a speech balloon you'll find there. And you can ask some questions here to the presenters, and we're happy to utilize this as best we can. Okay, so the CIFFC Research and Innovation Integration Committee have been hosting National Fire Management conversations for over 10 years, seeking to provide a blend of interview-style sessions and traditional information sharing webinars. If you have any ideas for future conversations, please let us know in the chat as well. We'd love to hear from you. Our committee is passionate about providing opportunities for students to share the important work they do to support our collective understanding of wildland fire in Canada. We seek to host 1 to 2 student sessions per year in pursuit of that goal. So today I'm so pleased to introduce Kennedy, Frederick, and Katya, who will share with us what they have learned about IA effectiveness and air tanker utilization. I'm going to turn off my screen here now so we can start this off. I'm just going to change a few things here. Perfect. Okay. So welcome, students. I think this is the time where we can share our we can turn our cameras off, give a little wave to the group. Welcome. Awesome. All right, welcome. I will introduce each of you separately as we go along, as your presentation comes up. We've got 3 students here today to join us. So I will introduce you, but Kennedy agreed to go first, so we'll start there. Kennedy Korkula is a PhD student at the University of Toronto, specializing in disturbance interactions within forest ecosystems, and resides in Toronto, Ontario, which is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kennedy to get her presentation up and running.
Great, thank you, Maria. Are you able to give me the screen sharing?
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Sorry, something.
All sorts of technical weird things happening today.
Okay, here we go. Great, is everyone able to see my screen?
Yeah, we're able to see it. Yeah, the front screen, yeah.
Perfect. All right. My name is Kennedy Corcola. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and today I'm going to be talking about the effects of eastern spruce budworm defoliation on models of forest fire containment in Ontario. So, disturbances play an important ecological role in the boreal forests of Canada. They help with stand restructuring, mitigating forest pests, and the recycling of forest nutrients. So, two important disturbances that we see in our boreal forests are wildfires and insect activity. And while we do know a little bit or a lot about insects and fire individually, we do know that they are both increasing in terms of their extent due to climate change. What we found in the literature, though, is that there's inconsistent findings on how these insects are affecting wildfires. And if we are expecting to see this increase in interaction and overlap, this inconsistency in these findings can have drastic effects on our understanding of forest succession, forest productivity, as well as firefighter safety in these insect-altered stands. So the eastern spruce budworm is a native defoliating insect in our boreal forests. It has periodic outbreaks, usually between 30 and 40 years, and can last anywhere from 5 to 15 years. The primary host species of the eastern spruce budworm are balsam fir and spruce species. And while mortality can occur after the fourth year of an outbreak, stands can change structurally up to 14 years following that outbreak. So if we see that these stands are changing in terms of their fuel load for up to 14 years, that represents a different fire hazard than what would typically be in these stands. So I've included just a map here and an image of what the spruce budworm looks like. The map I have here is showing the defoliation in different decades and just showing that the recent defoliation is occurring in Eastern Ontario around North Bay and Timmins. And what we've seen over the last 4 years is that we're having an increase in the amount of defoliation in Ontario. So 2022, much larger amount of area defoliated than previous years. So how is the spruce budworm going to affect fuels to alter wildfire behavior? So the fire behavior is made up of three components. So typically represented as the fire behavior triangle, we have weather, topography, and fuels. And these three things are interacting to influence fire behavior. So what I'm focusing on here is the impact of fuels. So how is the spruce budworm affecting the fuels in terms of amount, arrangement, and moisture to affect fire behavior? So trees killed by the spruce budworm are representing an increased fire hazard. Some research has suggested that we can see increased increased crown fires in these affected stands, increased ignition, and increased fire intensity. The effect, though, between spruce budworm and fire is going to vary between seasons. It's going to vary regionally, but also these two that I've included at the bottom are the time since defoliation. So how much time has passed since that outbreak or since that defoliation event, and the duration of that defoliation. So all of these are interacting to affect this interaction between wildfire and spruce budworm. So initial attack in Ontario is what my focus today is on. This is what our webinar is about, right? So what I want to know is, based on all of these things, based on these changes to fuels, are these fuels going to represent an increased hazard for firefighters in terms of their ability to move through those stands and lay hose? And is it going to affect fire conditions that are going to make it more difficult for a fire to contain? So initial attack is the initial action taken to limit or stop the spread of a fire. Fire management agencies want to contain fires as quickly as possible in order to mitigate the losses to values or threats to people, especially in the wildland-urban interface. So not all fires are fully suppressed, but we're focusing on fires that need to be suppressed in order to protect human life. So fire escape models are typically going to be including the size of the fire at initial attack, topography, different fire weather variables, fuels, and different fire management attributes such as response times and fire agency load. So I've highlighted fuels here because that's what we're focusing on today. So it is expected that fire escape is going to be increased, or escaping from initial attack is going to be increased in these spruce budworm defoliated stands due to fuel changes in terms of the structure, connectivity, and moisture, and differences in fire activity. So we have more fire ignitions, so an increased fire load, increased intensity, and increase in crown fires. All of these making fires more difficult to contain. So we expect, in these spruce budworm defoliated areas, fires are going to be difficult. Escaped fires can be significantly damaging and costly, so it's important that we understand, when these fires are going to escape and which stands they're more likely to escape in. So my question was, how does spruce budworm defoliation affect the probability of IA success? And specifically, what are the main drivers of IA success in the boreal forests of Ontario? And does including spruce budworm defoliation history improve our predictive models of IA success? So I started off by creating models for IA success using random forests in Ontario. So I started off by splitting this into Eastern Ontario and Western Ontario. So some of the things that I've looked at as predictors included the fuel type, response time, the fire size at IA, the season, and different fire weather indices. And I only included variables that were most important for the model. And then looking at how these are going to affect containment. And so in my models, I'm defining fire as contained if it is BHE, or being held. So the fire is not expected to grow anymore under forecasted conditions. So BHE by 1300 the following day, or before the following burning period. So I've made one for Eastern Ontario, and then I've also created this model for Western Ontario. And so I have these two different models, and then I want to see if adding spruce budworm defoliation history to these models is going to improve their predictive accuracy. So in the Eastern Ontario, we have now two models. So a spruce budworm model, which includes all those other predictors, but it also includes a predictors that represent defoliation history. And then we're comparing that to the model that does not include spruce budworm. And then we've also done the same thing for Western Ontario. So in total, I've come up with 4 different models of fire containment. So just looking at some of the data, in Western Ontario, the number of fires, 3,038. The amount contained, 2,512, with a percentage of contained at 82.7. So most of our fires are contained based on this definition of IA success. Very similar in Eastern Ontario, with 85.9% of fires contained based on the historical database. And so because we have this imbalance of data, we've balanced it to make sure that our models are not going to overfit the data. So the results that we saw from our random forest models is we looked at the accuracy, the area under the curve or receiver operator curve, the sensitivity, and the specificity. So our mean accuracy is just the overall predictive accuracy of the model. The AUC is looking at how well that model is going to differentiate between those IA successes and IA failures. The sensitivity is looking at whether that model is able to classify an IA failure correctly, and specificity is looking at the classification of IA successes correctly. So just looking at all of these different metrics allows us to assess whether or not our model has overfit the data. So I've built these models for Western and Eastern Ontario. And when we look at the differences overall, you can see that they're very similar. All of the models are performing really well. These numbers are on a scale of 0 to 1. And so most of them are above 0.83. So most of them are predicting really, really well. And then looking at which ones have significant differences, I did a test between them in the spruce budworm and no spruce budworm model. And in both the Western and Eastern regions, we can see that there are significant differences in the mean accuracy and the mean AUC. So what that tells us is that the spruce budworm model is actually performing better than the no spruce budworm model. And we also looked at effect size to look at whether or not this is a meaningful difference. It also suggests that there is a meaningful difference between these numbers, but when you look at them, right, they're very similar in terms of their predictive performance. Something else that we were looking at was which are the main drivers influencing IA success in these models. And what ends up, we don't need to look at the entirety of these graphs, but the main thing that I'm pointing out here is in each of these circled ones, this variable that is way above the rest is the size of the fire at initial attack. So that variable consistently across all of the models is the most important for predicting whether or not a fire is going to be a containment failure or a containment success. And then these two graphs here on the bottom are the ones showing my spruce budworm predictors. So just the ones that I've shown in the box here are those spruce budworm predictors. So they're kind of mid-range with the other predictors in the model. So what we found was that size at initial attack is consistently the most important variable. And I've done some preliminary work to suggest that the size at initial attack might be influenced by spruce budworm defoliation. And I don't know if anyone here has walked through spruce budworm defoliated stands, even spruce stands, right? They're very dense. And especially when you add in defoliation, you have so much fuel load on the ground. You have so many dead fuel, large trees have fallen over. Those areas are really hard to work in. And like anecdotally, I can say that it would be very hard to lay hose through those areas. And so just looking at the data, we found that the size of initial attack might be influenced by spruce budworm defoliation. And so we also found that there's some difference in the overall model accuracy and area under the curve, meaning that spruce budworm is contributing to the distinguishment between an IA success and an IA failure. And while these are considered statistically significant, all four models are performing well across all accuracy metrics. Differences were often less than 0.1. So while this suggests that spruce budworm defoliation is having some effect on containment, from a practical standpoint, including this data is not significantly improving model accuracy. There is some kind of effect, but if you're really looking at the model in terms of like a practical standpoint, oh, we're going to use these models, the amount of work to get that spruce budworm data and put it into the model isn't going to greatly improve your model's ability to perform or predict. So for future work, we should be focusing on gaining a better understanding of how spruce budworm is altering those fuels to affect fire behavior. So I've just put this little flow chart here. Spruce budworm is affecting fuels that affects fire behavior that's going to affect IA success. So kind of what this model has looked at is how spruce budworm is affecting IA success, but we can break this down further. And those middle pieces still have a lot of unanswered questions. So take homes, the interaction between spruce budworm defoliation and wildfire behavior is not fully understood, and we lack knowledge on the consequences of these interactions. So these specific things that we need better understanding of are how are these fuels changing, and how are these fuels changing to affect fire behavior attributes that might make fires more difficult to contain. So large fires are typically those that are escaping our firefighting efforts, and they pose a threat to ecosystem resilience and resistance, and increased potential to cause large economic loss, threats to human health, large-scale evacuations, and damages to infrastructure and values. So while we saw that spruce budworm defoliation has some effect on wildfire containment, more work needs to be done to better understand the fuels, how they're changing following an outbreak. And we also found that size at IA is a good indicator for whether a fire will escape. Therefore, it's important that when suppression is required, we need to contain fires quickly and at small sizes, regardless of fuel type. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kennedy. Lots to chew on there for sure. I was just thinking, unfortunately, we've got such limited time to get through all these presentations. No questions in the chat right now, but we'll probably circle back at the end to see if we've got questions for each of the three speakers. Maybe that will be the best approach.
That's great. Or people can email me as well if they have any questions.
Yeah, and Kennedy, if you're able to, and it would be great if you could put your contact information in the chat. That would be awesome. Thank you.
That's under general, right?
Yeah. Yeah, lots to get through today. It's crazy. I don't know. We should expand these 1 hour sessions for sure. Frederick, you can I'll give you an opportunity to load it as I introduce you. Next up is Frederick Brunet. He's a master's student at Laval University, supervised by Mathieu Bouchard and Jonathan Boucher, with a focus on the use of statistical modeling and optimization frameworks to improve resource deployment in wildfire operations. He will be starting as a PhD student in the fall of this year, focusing on risk mitigation through fuels management at different scales. He resides in Quebec City on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat. And with that, I will hand it over to Frederick.
Great. You can hear me well?
I can hear you well. Yeah. Again, it's very sensitive. So unfortunately, if you're like me, we can't move around too much, but I can hear you really well. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, great. So today I'll be presenting to you the work I've been doing on my master's for the past 1.5 years. And it's on identifying and reducing the impact of factors that influence response times of hell attack IA teams in the province of Quebec. So, first of all, the aims of the project. A bit of background, when this project came through, there was this hypothesis that if we modified the base placement of deployment teams in the province of Quebec, we could help reduce response times. But before looking at that, we wanted to identify better the factors that actually influence our response times. So more precisely, the influence of same-day departure time, next-day departure time, and travel time of IA teams in the province of Quebec. And the second chapter was more to suggest an improvement to the current deployment strategy that could help either reduce departure or travel time based on the results of the first chapter. So first of all, why do we analyze departure time and travel time separately instead of overall response time? As you can see in the graph, we can subdivide response time into 3 different times. The first one being dispatch time. So from the moment our fire is detected to the moment the actual fire is dispatched to a certain base or team. And that time is usually stable, around 15 minutes per policy in Quebec. Then we have departure time, which is mainly influenced by fire managers. So departure time is from the moment a fire is dispatched to a team to the moment the team actually leaves the deployment site. And finally, we have travel time, which is more influenced by physical factors, and that's from the moment a team leaves the base to the moment the team arrives on the fire. So we decided to focus more on departure time and travel time, since dispatch time is relatively stable. So first of all, the study area and a bit about the data. We only worked with fires that are located in the intensive protection zone of Quebec. So these are fires that get full response. We took fires over a 20-year span from 2002 to 2022. Before 2002, data was pretty insufficient, and we couldn't do any analysis with that data. And we only took fires that were serviced by hell attack teams. So not fires that were serviced by ground crews or only by air tankers. And finally, we selected around 1,300 fires out of a potential of 2,500 fires. And that's mainly because a lot of fires had to be rejected due to insufficient data. And this data was pulled from 2 separate databases, the Operational Objective Database and the Aviation Flight Leg Database from CIFFC. So before going into the statistical models, here's a bit the presentation of all the variables we included in our models. These were considered based on previous studies and also on our own hypothesis. And some of the variables were chosen with model selection, mostly for weather variables and active fires. Without going through all the variables, I'll present to you a couple of them that aren't as common. So number of flight legs, that's the number of flights a helicopter has to take to get to a fire, and that ranges from 1 to 2 flights. Then we have rate of spread, which is based off of fire weather indices, and that's predicted head fire spread rate at the point where the fire ignited. And finally, we have number of active fires, and that represents a fire load in the province of Quebec, so the number of active fires in the province for that specific date. We also included the year of the fire as a random variable to take into account changes in resources, deployment bases throughout those 20 years. So for the analysis, we had 3 models, which were all generalized linear mixed models. we had a same-day departure time model and a next-day departure time model, as well as a travel time model. The difference between same-day and next-day departure time is when the fire is actually attacked. So sometimes we get fires that come in at 8 p.m. It's too dark to send out a hell attack team, and those fires need to be attacked on the next morning. Well, those were analyzed in the second model because the response time is much higher. It's going to be close to 8 to 10 hours instead of 1 to 2 hours. So for same-day departure time, we included dispatch hour, rate of spread, date, number of active fires, and departure base. Same thing for next-day departure time. And finally, for travel time, we included distance, number of flight legs, departure base, and year as a random variable. So these are the results, the base results. So all the variables were significant except for the next-day departure time model where only the dispatch hour had an effect. Now I'll present to you a bit the effect of each of these variables, but only the main variables. We won't go over the next day departure time model or those low impact variables. So the variable that has the most importance on same day departure time is dispatch hour. So we can see that a fire that's dispatched at, let's say, 1 p.m. instead of 8 a.m. will have approximately a departure time that's close to 50 minutes faster. So what that shows is that there's a big effect of deployment policies on our response times. Usually ordered deployment starts at 1 p.m. and sometimes up to 8 a.m. So we see that these fires that happen early in the morning, well, sometimes teams aren't ready to intervene, and thus, well, we see higher response times. Then we have rate of spread. So let's say we have extreme fire behavior, 25 to 30 meters per minute of rate of spread compared to very low fire behavior of 1 meter per minute. Well, we'll see a diminishing predicted departure time of around 12 minutes. So this shows that fire managers will send out teams faster when we have fires that have higher stakes. So it shows the system is actually working. Then we have the Julian date, which is the third factor in importance. It basically shows that we respond to fires faster during the summer period from May till August, and then during the fall, which are lower priority fires, will respond a bit slower, which is normal. So we really respond faster to fires that are in this peak period where we can get extreme fire behavior and big fires, basically. And the last factor to have an influence, well, a big influence, is the departure base. Now, it's not every departure base that has an influence, but what this graph shows is that when we deploy teams from an active fire to a new fire, we see much higher departure times. So this shows that the team has to pack up its equipment, has to get on the helicopter and get to the new fire. So that happens usually when we have too many fires on the territory and we have to stretch out our teams. So we can see higher departure times in those situations. And the graph you can see on the screen is a violin plot graph. So each base has its own violin. Let's say for the Maniwaki base, we can see the distribution of the fires that were attacked by that base. And we can see that a couple of bases, so Roberval, Val-d'Or, Maniwaki, have a lot more fires that are attacked from them than, let's say, bases like Camp Daniel or Murdochville. So this affects the data quality. We could also link an effect of these time differences based on the disposition of the bases. So the distance between the waiting area of crews and the helipad, as well as just normal regional policies. So then we'll talk a bit more about the travel time model. The factor that had the highest impact was really the distance. When we see the distance increase by around 150 kilometers, we'll see an increase in predicted travel time by 37 minutes. So what this shows is basically that if we lower the distance between new fire starts and deployed teams, this is the most efficient way to reduce the travel time to new fires. And then the second factor in importance is the number of flight legs. So when we increase from 1 to 2 flights to get to a fire, we increase predicted travel time by around 35 minutes. So there's a few reasons why we would take 2 flights to get to a fire. Sometimes it's the helicopter needs to refuel, we need additional crew members or equipment. And how we could reduce these instances where we have 2 flight legs, well, either reduce the distance between new fire starts and our crews, or either increase our helicopter fuel autonomy. And how we can do this is by lowering the actual payload in the helicopter. So either bring in less equipment or less crew members And this could help put more fuel in the helicopter and reduce the instances where 2 flight legs are needed. We won't go over departure base or year. These factors did have an influence on travel time, but was pretty minimal, so we won't go over them. So the key points for the first chapter of my master's is that dispatch hour has the highest impact on same day and next day departure time. Then distance and the number of flight legs has the highest impact on travel time. If we focus on reducing distance and the number of flight legs, we'll have the highest impact on travel time and overall response time. We could also work on dispatch hour, but dispatch hour is mainly controlled by internal policies, so we can't really work on that. So we'll be focusing more on distance and number of flight legs. So we thought to ourselves, how could we reduce the distance between new fire starts and our deployed teams? Well, the current deployment strategy in Quebec is based on the coverage of predicted head fire intensity. So based on predicted head fire intensity on the next day, we'll deploy teams up to 18 deployment bases. On the right, you can see the graph that is basically a simplified version of this decision tree. And we thought to ourselves, could we use an optimization model that could work with this decision tree and offer a better coverage, either using these 18 deployment sites, or if we added potential deployment sites, could we increase the model's performance? So to do this, we use a maximal covering location problem, which is an optimization algorithm. The objective of this model was to maximize the number of covered pixels that each have a different weight based on predicted head fire intensity, using a predetermined number of available teams. We tested this model with 10 different days from 2018 to 2022, and with 2 different scenarios. The first scenario was using only the 18 primary deployment sites currently used in Quebec. And the second scenario, we use up to 98 possible deployment sites. These are all the fuel and equipment caches that are throughout the province and that have a helipad. So we have a couple of preliminary results using this model. On the left is a historic deployment that was done using the actual decision tree and 18 bases. In the middle is the optimization model using 18 bases. And on the right, it's the optimization model using 98 possible deployment bases. Quickly, what we saw is that we see an increase in performance when using 98 possible deployment sites, but with the actual only 18 sites, the decision tree and the optimization model have a pretty similar performance. So what are the next steps for this model? Well, right now it's showing some promising results, but we need to work better on the model to better reflect reality. It's hard to represent a very complex system with a simple optimization model, but we're working to develop not a new deployment system, but more a complementary tool that could be used for deploying teams. Right now, what the model does, it does help cover areas that are sometimes ignored by the current decision tree. And we'll try to run it with a lot more days to see its performance, because 10 days is a pretty small sample. So during next fall, we'll try to test it with a lot more days. But right now, what we can see with the graph that's at the bottom of the slide is when we use 98 possible deployment sites, we can offer the same coverage than historical deployment, but with a lower amount of deployed teams. So we can see that the baseline scenario, let's say we deploy 15 teams, well, we'll usually get a better coverage in the historic deployment. And we can go up down to 13 teams, so -1 or -2 deployment teams, and then offer the same coverage as a historic deployment. But if we do this with the base scenario, so only with 18 bases, well, the coverage really drops in performance. So it's really the fact that adding possible deployment sites could help offer better coverage more than the optimization model. So in conclusion, for the first chapter, focus should really be taken on travel time, which is mainly influenced by distance and the number of flight legs to get to a fire. This information can help us reduce response times when quick action is needed, so near communities and infrastructure. It's not every fire that needs a quick response time, but when we have communities and infrastructure, well, we can put the work and the effort to reduce these response times. And finally, the optimization framework is showing promising results, but it does need some work to be considered a complete tool. So that does it for me. Thank you very much for your time and listening to me.
All right, thanks so much, Frederick. I'm really impressed on the time, the 15-minute thing. You guys have both been doing really well, so thanks for that. Because we definitely want to leave some time at the end for questions, so I appreciate that. Yeah, some great information in there for sure. We're gonna roll over to Katia, a little bit of a different approach to her research for sure. And I'll just promote you to presenter. Yeah. So Katia Davy-Dubois is a master's student at University of Alberta in renewable resources, focusing on optimizing air tanker utilization and supervised by Dr. Jen Beverly. Katia resides in Edmonton, Alberta, within Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis Homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 4. So with that, I'll hand it over to you. I think we're all set.
Okay.
It's not on. Yeah, I can see your screen. It's not on full screen. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. As mentioned, I'm Katia Davy-Dubois. I'm a student at U of A and part of the Wildfire Analytics Lab led by Dr. Jen Beverly. And the funding for my project comes from NSERC, Alberta Wildfire, through Canada Wildfire. And I'd like to thank several contributors and supporters for this, including Alberta Wildfire staff and contractors such as Dave Schroeder and air attack officers who have helped with this study. So I'm looking at modeling air tanker basing for wildfire utilization in Alberta. I wanted to see if I could develop a model that simulates air tanker relocations. So a model like this can help provide information on air tanker day basing, base changing, home basing. It can aid in the selection of next generation air tankers, and it can help identify high-risk areas with minimal coverage. So I'm sure a lot of you know aircrafts are expensive, so even small improvements can lead to significant savings. So a quick few definitions. An initial action drop is a drop from an air tanker that was completed the first day of a fire during continuous action. A land-based air tanker is an air tanker that has to be loaded at an air tanker base. And then a skimmer aircraft can be loaded at an air tanker base, or they can skim off of a water body. So in this model, I'm making an assumption that skimmers will only load off of a water body and not at an air tanker base. So I received drop reports from Alberta Wildfire ranging from 2007 to 2022. I'm only looking at IA drops for now, and ones that were not marked as canceled or drops from diversions. I removed anything that was missing important data, so that would be like a fire number, fire ID, drop location, so on. And the drop reports are manually inputted from air attack officers. So I did make a few modifications where there were clear errors, but for the most part, it was good to go. My air tanker specifications came from the Air Tanker Base Operations Handbook from Alberta Wildfire, and I'm basing the fleet on the 2023 Alberta tanker fleet. So that's 8 groups with 16 air tankers. So we have 4 types of air tankers in that fleet. Our smallest are the 802 amphibs, so the skimmer aircraft. We have 1 group of 4. We have 1 group of 4 802 land-based. 2 groups of 2 CL-215s, which are skimmers, and then 4 groups of our largest air tanker, which is the Electra, and is land-based. My study area is the Alberta Forest Protection Area, or FPA. So that is this dark gray area that you see on the map on the right. Also pictured are the 13 current air tanker bases in Alberta. So my model takes hazard as an input. So one of the first hazard layers I'm using is the fire weather index. This is a daily hazard level, and pictured on the right, where light yellow is the lowest and dark red is extreme. Another hazard layer I have is the landscape fire exposure metric. So this is an annual exposure, and it is following the method developed by Beverly, McLaughlin, and Chapman. And last, I have a developed land layer. So this is from polygons of developed land indicating values in Alberta, and this was put together by myself and a fellow master's student, Carter Cooper. Next, I needed to define the area of action for each air tanker. So the area of action is the actionable area of a tanker from a specified base in a specified amount of time. So for land-based air tankers, I'm looking at 15-minute areas of action. For example, this tanker base right here, this is Fort McMurray for those who know. For an 802, this circle is the area of action for an 802 from the Fort McMurray tanker base. And similarly, we have the ones on the right are for the Electras. Next, I needed the area of action for our skimmer aircrafts. So this first map that you see are the skimmable water sources across the province. For skimmers, since they're not being loaded at the tanker base before departure, I used a 25-minute area of action. And that is the time from a base to a water source. So for example, this base right here, I think you guys can see my mouse. For an 802 amphib, these polygons here are the area of action for an 802 amphib at this specific air tanker base. And it's not pictured, but I would have a similar map for the CL215Ts. So once I have my hazard layers and my area of actions, I could input those into an optimization model. This iterates through the possibilities and outputs the best possible basing based on the fleet and the hazard. So this is an example of what I would get out of that model using the Alberta fleet here. These dark blue circles are the 4 electric groups. This purple is our 802s. The green are our CL215 groups, and this light blue is our 802 amphib group. So this output that you're seeing was using exposure as the hazard. I ran this from 2007 to 2023, and the results were consistent across every year except for 2012 and 2022. However, the differences were insignificant. So when it came to the annual hazard or the exposure, this basing that you see here was used across all years. So I would get a similar output depending for all of the versions that I ran with the different hazards. So I wanted to check the performance of this model. So I checked it I first compared the daily and seasonal basing. So daily predicted is using moving the tankers around every day and then checking that distance to observed fires. I used different hazard layers for the daily basing, which includes using just FWI or combining that with exposure and values. And so far, the best results are from only using FWI. So those are the results you'll see coming up. I have the seasonal predicted, so that's using exposure as the hazard and keeping the tankers in one spot for the whole season. I also allowed for multi-dispatch, so sending multiple tanker groups to a fire, as well as allowing for dual coverage areas. So areas that were high hazard could be dual coverage. So for exposure, that would be 60% and up. For FWI, that would be very high and extreme. So I'm not going to go through each box plot to save time, but basically what we're seeing here is whether I'm moving the tankers around every day or keeping them in one spot or allowing for dual coverage, we don't see a significant difference either way out of this model. So we see a slight rise when we allow for multiple groups to be dispatched to one fire, which is expected, but no significant differences. So something interesting to point out here is keeping the tankers in one spot for the whole season is producing similar results to moving the tankers around each day. And I'll also say the results are using 17 years of data. However, if you break it down into individual years, we get consistent results each year. So I also wanted to compare this to the observed data. So I ran the model with random basing as well to compare it to those results. I have the minimum distance, so from the IA fires to the closest air tanker base. In a perfect world, that's where we'd want to group based. We have the observed first dispatch. So that is the distance from the first group that was dispatched to a fire to the fire itself. And then we have the observed, which is the distance from every group dispatched to a fire to the fire. And I compared these results to the seasonal predicted distances. So this box plot on the left that we see, this is if the tankers were based randomly each day. And the second one is the minimum distance to the fire from the closest tanker base. So these gray box plots are from the observed data and the orange are from my model. So this first one is dispatching, or this is the first group that was dispatched to a fire compared to what that distance would be if the air tankers were based using the model output. And then again, these two results here, this is observed. So this is the distance from every group that was dispatched to a fire. And then this is the model results using the same number of air tanker groups as was observed. So I'll point out here, across the board, we don't see a huge difference in our mean or median. However, we do see differences in our spread. So we see decrease from the observed to the predicted in both scenarios, and our maximum values are decreased. So just reiterating the results on the last page, our mean and median are pretty consistent. However, our max decreases. So the observed maximum is 445 nautical miles, and that decreases to 195 for one dispatch and 254 for multiple dispatches. And then again, our standard deviation decreases from 50 to 27 and 54 to 34. So what that means is our average travel time isn't changing much, but the model is producing fewer long-range dispatches to fires. These results are still preliminary. However, they do suggest that further studies on a home basing method could be useful in keeping the air tankers in one spot for the season instead of moving them around. Just so we have time for questions, I won't go through every single one of these, but I want to point out a few. The model does not take into account things such as weather, so visibility, hail, delays at air tanker bases. It doesn't take into account tankers that are being used on sustained action fires or busy elsewhere. And it also assumes that all skimmable lakes are usable year-round. This is not always the case, depending on the season or even time of year. And so that can alter the basing output based on which skimmable lakes are available to use. And yeah, I will leave it there so we have time for questions.
All right, thanks so much. While everyone's frantically putting their questions in the chat, I have a general question for each of you. I'm thinking now I should have warned you of this question. You may get away from it if I get questions ahead of time, but we just did get a thank you very much for the presentations. Appreciate their observations and evaluation information. I'm not surprised there isn't questions because there's just so much to take in. I want to remind the audience that these presentations are recorded. These national conversations are recorded. This one as well will be up on YouTube, our CIFFC YouTube channel, and on our website. So I'll put in the chat where you'll be able to find this probably within a month, I would say, both available in English and French. So one of the questions I guess I have for each of you, putting you a little bit on the spot, a lot of feedback. I think some sort of air tanker taking off. Here we go. If you based on your research, and I know particular master's versus PhDs, with your master's, you're not able to dig too much into the details, but we do serve these webinars do serve our practitioners, our wildland fire practitioners. So based on your research, do you have any recommendations to the wildland fire practitioners that you would suggest moving forward on? I understand there's limitations, and you've all done actually a pretty good job of the limitations and assumptions in your data or research, but is there any hint of what recommendations you would provide wildland fire based on your research? And I know there's a dangerous game, lots of caveats to it, but anything there that you'd like to share? I'll start with Kennedy.
I'm not sure that I have any recommendations right now. I mean, I definitely have more work to do, and I think that researchers and practitioners are both doing their best in terms of collecting data and utilizing, the outputs of everyone's research. Um, yeah,
That's fair. Okay, over to Frederick, just going in order of the presentation.
Great. I don't have anything specific. Maybe one of the main obstacles when I was working on my master's was, data accessibility and quality. CIFFC was really helpful with giving me some really great quality data. But sometimes, you're on the field, you're filling in a fire journal, you think it's never going to be used again. But then 10 years pass, I'm using that fire journal and incomplete data, well, I can't work with it. So sometimes just having quality data is really useful. Sometimes it's 20 years down. We don't think of that when we're on the field, but in retrospect, it's pretty important. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Katya.
I was basically going to say what Frederick had said. And from experience working with fire, there are lots of people who don't understand the importance of accurate data recording because they think, oh, it's one and done. It's never going to be used again. And so that's definitely one of the biggest challenges working with the data is knowing that some of it is wrong.
Yeah, really great point. Thank you for that. And I think we're doing a better job, the wildland fire community of connecting with researchers a little bit better. I know sometimes there's hurdles in getting the data, and then there's also hurdles in getting out in the field. I think that's improving. I'm hopeful that that's improving, that we're seeing a lot of the value in the research, and we're making provisions to be able to get the researchers out into the field during our operations, that sort of thing, supporting that as best we can. So again, just a reminder, at the top right-hand corner, there's a chat box, if you have any questions for folks that presented here today. I have a question for Kennedy, and I may have missed it. I know there was a lot happening at the beginning in terms of people popping in as presenters. I'm just wondering, so you talked about the spruce bedworm, there it happened again. And so I'm not sure, I missed maybe the attributes part of it, but how can we think about, when you said, your models were doing really well in predicting can we glean anything from the spruce bedworm data into other disturbances, and what sort of attributes are we able to kind of share among the data, the information and the research that you're doing with other types of disturbances, that type of thing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the spruce budworm, or the eastern spruce budworm specifically, it's a challenging thing to model because we have to balance that difference between, okay, how long has it been since that defoliation event has happened? And then on top of that, how long did that defoliation event occur for? The trees don't die immediately, and it takes time over many years for those trees to experience mortality, and then maybe they recover and we don't have any stand structural changes at all. I do think that it can be compared to other defoliators that we see in the forest. And I know that, at least here in Ontario, we had a lot of issue with the spongy moth, or there's issues with forest tent caterpillar, a little bit different of a system because it's occurring in deciduous forests, which are much less likely to have large amounts of or really intense fires. So I think different disturbances that maybe are slow moving or maybe have that interaction between cumulative but time since disturbance as well. I think that the way that I've modeled it could be applicable to those systems as well. And I saw another question in the chat about how appropriate response incidents were treated. So my models are only looking at full suppression. So I didn't look at any appropriate response or modified response. All of it was on, was that fire, was the goal for full suppression.
Okay, thank you. Just looking in the chat here. Whoops. Okay, question for Frederick. Was a zero change in staffing, recruitment, and retention experience per year? You can see it in the chat here. I'll just read it out though. Was a zero change in staffing factored into the analysis of response times? And then there was assumption that there was no changes in staffing numbers year over year of study period, and the province had its full complement of IA, human IA resources available.
So to take into account a bit like the change in resources throughout the years, we used the year as a random variable, but we didn't really look at it as an actual factor in the staffing of each year. So we a bit took it into account through that random variable, but it had a pretty low effect when we looked at it globally, if that makes sense as an answer.
Yeah, Tony, certainly. Okay, thank you. Question here from Jason Robinson. What data do you think is missing or would you like to see from either the agencies or the aerial firefighting operators to better support your studies? Great question. And maybe we'll start with Katya. The question's in the chat if you need to see it again.
Okay. Yeah, specifically working with air tanker data. I think one of the biggest things I'd like to see is some sort of even just error checking in it. Like there are entries where people are entering that the distance from a tanker base to a fire was 1 kilometer when it was actually 47 kilometers. But that can easily be checked using the location of the fire in the tanker base. But there are like certain attributes that you can't check as easily. So like the amount of retardant dropped on a fire, the amount of water dropped on a fire, those types of aspects there's some that are obviously wrong in the data, and I just have to remove them. So just an extra step to ensure that the data is being inputted properly would be a big help for me.
All right, thank you. And then so with our 2 minutes left, maybe we'll end with this question.
One thing.
Yeah, Kennedy, go ahead.
Just to add on to that, in the Ontario data, I don't know if it's feasible, but when we look at the size of the fire at initial attack or even the final fire size, the lowest threshold that we have is 0.1 hectares. And so oftentimes we have this inflated data towards a 0.1 hectare fire, which is a pretty sizable space, right? But a lot of those fires are just like maybe a campfire that kind of went outside its boundaries, still got a fire number, but it's more equivalent to like a 0.01 hectare fire, right? And so a lot of those fires that are classified in the Ontario database as a 0.1 often need to be removed because it's not showing any fire growth, when in reality, it might have been growing from a 0.01 to a 0.1 hectare fire.
All right, thanks for that, Kennedy. And we'll end with maybe Frederick answering that question. What do you think is missing or would you like to see from either the agencies or the aerial firefighting operators to better support your studies?
Well, I think it was a bit said before, it really comes down to data quality and data checking. Sometimes I had fires that had a negative response time or negative distances just because, let's say, it was marked as contained on the 1st of July, but the initial attack was in, let's say, May. So just data checking and making sure we're writing in the good information, because most of the information is written down by hand, could really help us in the long run, I say. It's pretty simple.
That's great. Well, we kept our time. This is amazing. Obviously, there's lots more questions to ask. That's the thing about research. You probably have way more questions than answers. But the answers that you do have are really valuable, and we're really happy that you were able to share that with us today. So thanks again to all of you. And again, check us out on YouTube, the CIFFC YouTube channel. And good luck with the rest of your studies. And we hope to catch up with you in the field someday. Thanks, everyone. Bye.